The barn door hadn't been opened in 11 years. Harold knew this because the last time he'd walked through it, his son Calvin was 14 years old and still thought his father hung the moon. That was before the deployment, before the second one, before the thing in Kandahar that Harold never talked about and Calvin never stopped resenting him for. Now Harold was 63, standing in knee-high grass on 40 acres of Manitoba farmland that smelled like rust and old rain, and the only living creature on earth that seemed genuinely glad to see him was a 3-year-old Belgian Malinois named Copper, who was currently pressing his warm flank against Harold's left leg like he could feel the tremor. Harold was trying very hard to hide. The farmhouse behind him had been his father's, his grandfather's before that. 3 generations of Decker men had worked this land, pulled wheat from it, buried their dead in the small plot behind the eastern fence line, where the spruce trees grew close together and blocked the wind in winter. Harold had inherited it the same week his marriage ended. A coincidence so perfectly timed that he'd laughed in the parking lot of his lawyer's office, until the laughing turned into something else entirely, and a woman walking by had asked if he needed an ambulance. He didn't need an ambulance. He needed about 6 months of sleep and maybe a different life. What he got was copper and 40 acres, and the faint smell of his father still clinging to the walls of a house he hadn't set foot in since the funeral. His ex-wife Lorraine had kept the house in Winnipeg, the furniture, the good car, most of the savings account that Harold had spent 22 years filling. Her lawyer had been thorough and quick and faintly pleased with herself, in a way that made Harold feel like a fish that had swum into a net, without noticing until the net was already closed. He hadn't fought it the way he should have. The VA counselor said that was common. Men who'd been trained to endure tended to keep enduring long past the point where they should have stopped and said something. Harold had been saying nothing his whole adult life. He was good at it. He'd driven out to the farm in early April, with Copper riding shotgun, and 1 bag of clothes in the back seat and a box of his father's books that nobody else had wanted. The roads out of the city had been long and flat and quiet, and for the first time in maybe a decade, Harold had felt something in his chest loosen slightly. Not heal, not fix, just loosen. The farmhouse was in worse shape than he'd expected. The front steps had rotted through on one side. A window in the kitchen was cracked, patched with a square of cardboard that had been there long enough to turn soft with moisture. The wallpaper in the hallway had started peeling from the top corners and hung down in pale strips, like something shy retreating from the room. The smell inside was dust and mouse and time, but the bones were good. Harold walked the rooms slowly the first evening, Copper trotting ahead of him and then doubling back, and he could see the bones were solid. His grandfather had built to last. The floors were oak, thick planks that barely shifted underfoot. The walls were plaster over lath, not drywall. The staircase banister was hand-turned, a detail Harold ran his palm along and stood still for a long moment, because his grandfather's hands had touched this thing, and his father's hands, and the continuity of it was something he hadn't expected to feel so hard. He slept on a camping mat that first night with Copper curled beside him, and woke up to birdsong so loud it was almost aggressive. He thought, this is something. This could be something. The days settled into a rhythm that suited him in a way that nothing had suited him in years. He woke early. He made coffee on the propane camp stove he'd brought, until he got the kitchen range working. He walked the property with Copper in the mornings, the two of them moving through the long grass while the dew was still heavy and the light came in low from the east. He made notes about what needed fixing. There was a lot. The list grew every day. But there was something meditative about it that Harold hadn't anticipated. He'd spent his career in the military, responding to other people's urgencies, and then he'd spent the years after the military responding to Lorraine's urgencies, and her family's, and the job at the security firm that had been fine, but never once made him feel like himself. This, walking his own land, cataloging his own problems, making his own decisions about what to do next. Felt like a language he'd forgotten he knew. Copper was good company. Better than good. The dog had been bred and trained through a veteran support program and had a quality of attention Harold had never encountered in a human being. A steadiness, an unhurried alertness, a way of being completely present without any agenda attached to it. When Harold sat on the back porch in the evenings with his coffee gone cold, Copper would sit beside him, and the two of them would watch the light go out of the sky, and Harold would think, "This is the most peace I have felt since I was a young man, and I'm not sure what to do with it." He called Calvin twice in those first weeks. Calvin lived in Calgary now, working in oil logistics, married to a woman named Deborah, who had never once said a warm thing to Harold in 8 years of knowing him. The calls were short. Calvin asked if Harold was okay. Harold said yes. Calvin said that was good then. There was a silence like a field between them that neither of them knew how to cross. And then they said goodbye, and Harold held the phone for a minute after, looking at nothing. He didn't call again after that. What he did instead was work. He fixed the front steps in the second week, pulling the rotted boards and replacing them with lumber. He drove 40 minutes into town to buy. He reglazed the kitchen window. He got the old range working again with a replacement part he found online and waited 4 days for. He patched the roof over the back bedroom where a section of shingle had gone soft. He did it all himself, slowly, methodically, the way his father had taught him to approach any problem. Start at the edges, work toward the center. Don't rush the part that matters most. He was rewiring the light fixture in the hallway on a Thursday afternoon when Copper stopped. Harold noticed because the dog had been circling the base of the staircase, the way he sometimes did when he was restless. A lazy figure-8 pattern that Harold had come to understand as the dog's version of thinking. But he'd stopped that, and now he was standing very still at the base of the stairs, nose low to the floor, ears forward. And Harold had spent enough time with this dog to know that particular posture meant something. "What is it?" Harold said. Copper didn't look up. He took 3 slow steps toward the underside of the staircase, where the wall met the floor in the shadow beneath the lowest step, and then he sat down and looked back at Harold with an expression of complete seriousness. Harold had renovated enough of the house by then to have looked at most of its walls. He'd looked at this one too, briefly. It was just wall, plaster, painted a dark green that had been fashionable sometime in the 40s, the paint now chalky and dull. There was a hook on it where his father had always hung his coat. But Copper was not looking at the hook. Harold got down on one knee and looked at where the dog's attention was focused, the very base of the wall, where the plaster met the baseboard. And he saw it then, very faint, almost invisible. A seam. Not the seam of the baseboard. A vertical seam, slightly irregular, running from the floor up about 3 feet and then turning horizontal. He pressed his palm against the wall, and it gave slightly, just slightly, in a way that solid plaster over lath would not. He stood. He went to the kitchen and got the small flat pry bar he'd been using for the renovation work. He came back, and Copper was still sitting in exactly the same position, still watching the wall. Harold worked the pry bar along the seam carefully, not wanting to damage anything he didn't need to damage. The plaster was thick, and the resistance was real, but after a few minutes of careful work, there was a sound like a held breath being released, and a section of the wall, roughly 2 feet wide, 3 feet tall, swung inward on hinges that had been plastered over and painted, and completely invisible until this moment. Harold sat back on his heels. He looked at the dark space beyond. Copper looked at Harold. "All right," Harold said. He got his headlamp from the toolbox. He crouched and pointed the light into the cavity behind the wall. It was a small space, maybe 4 feet deep by 3 feet wide, clearly built into the structure of the house deliberately. The framing was clean, intentional. This hadn't been a mistake or an afterthought. Somebody had built this room within the wall. Somebody had decided, a long time ago, that there were things worth hiding. On the floor of the space sat an old metal strongbox, the kind with a hinged lid and a simple latch, the dark green paint of it flaking and furred with age. Beside it, wrapped in oilcloth that had dried and cracked with time but still held its shape, was what appeared to be a roll of papers, and beside that, smaller, sitting on top of the oilcloth, as though it had been placed there last and most carefully, a folded letter in an envelope, the envelope sealed with wax, and addressed in handwriting Harold recognized immediately. His father's handwriting. Harold's name on the envelope. Harold sat on the floor of the hallway for a long moment, his back against the opposite wall, copper pressed against his side, and he looked at that envelope and felt something move through him that he didn't have a name for. Not shock, exactly. Something older than shock. The feeling of a door opening that you'd been standing in front of for years without realizing it was there. He picked up the envelope last. He opened the strongbox first. Inside the box were two things. The first was a bundle of documents held together with a rubber band that had dried and cracked, but still functioned, loosely. Property surveys. Harold unfolded the top one and recognized the shape of the land immediately. His land, the 40 acres, but the survey was dated 1961 and showed the original boundaries his grandfather had established when he'd first claimed the parcel. Underneath were two more surveys, and under those, the original Crown land grant, the actual paper his great-grandfather had received when the land had first been registered. Harold spread it carefully on the hallway floor. The paper was fragile and brown at the edges, but the text was still legible, the government seal still visible, the land description written in careful copperplate. He read it twice. The second thing in the box was money. Not a small amount of money, banded stacks of 50s and 100s old bills, the kind that had been out of circulation for years but were still legal tender. Harold counted it twice and sat very still. $46,000. He opened the roll of papers next. They were architectural drawings, detailed plans for expanding the farmhouse, a project his father had apparently designed himself, room by room, addition by addition, in pencil on drafting paper. His father had never been a draftsman, but the drawings were careful and precise, and clearly the product of many hours of quiet work. There were notes in the margins in his father's hand, measurements, material lists, questions to himself, the occasional small arrow pointing to a detail he wanted to remember. One note, in the margin of a drawing that showed a new room off the back of the house, read simply, "For when Harold comes home." Harold had to stop. He put the drawings down carefully and pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and looked at the ceiling and breathed. Copper put his head in Harold's lap. They sat like that for a while. When he was ready, he opened the letter. His father had written it 6 years before he died, during a period Harold now knew had been a difficult one. His mother had been sick, the farm had been running at a loss, and his father had been quietly managing both problems alone in the way that Decker men apparently did. Harold hadn't known any of this at the time because he'd been stationed overseas, and the communication between them had been sparse and awkward in the way that it always was. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten, in the small neat print his father had used for important things. It began, "Harold, I've been meaning to write this down for years, and I keep not doing it, so here it is." His father explained the money first. He'd been putting it aside since Harold was a boy. Small amounts at first, then larger, whenever the farm turned enough profit to allow it. He'd never trusted banks entirely, a distrust he'd inherited from his own father, who had lived through the Depression and regarded financial institutions with permanent suspicion. The money was Harold's, and had always been intended for Harold, for the farm, for whatever Harold needed to build a life here, if he ever chose to come back to it. Then his father explained the land documents. The farm had been threatened, twice, by disputes Harold had never known about. Once by a neighboring landowner who had tried to claim a portion of the eastern boundary, and once, more recently, by a distant cousin who had surfaced after Harold's mother's death and made noises about entitlement to the property. His father had dealt with both situations quietly and thoroughly, and the documents in the strongbox were the evidence. The surveys, the original grant, the legal correspondence that would conclusively establish the Decker claim to the land against any future challenge. "I'm not telling you this to worry you," his father wrote. "I'm telling you because you need to know the land is yours, fully and completely yours. Whatever anyone tells you, whatever anyone tries to claim, it was your grandfather's, then mine. And now it's yours, and the papers prove it, and no one can take it from you." Harold read that paragraph 3 times. Then he read the last page. His father wrote about the farm, the way Harold had never heard him speak about it in person, with a directness and a tenderness that the old man had never quite managed face to face. The way some people can only say the true thing when they have the distance of pen and paper to protect them. He wrote about what the land had meant to him, about the early mornings, the particular quality of Manitoba light in August, the smell of the soil after rain, about Harold's grandfather standing at the fence line in the evenings looking west, a habit Harold's father had inherited, and Harold had apparently inherited in turn. Without ever noticing, he wrote about Harold. He wrote that he had not always understood his son, that the military had taken Harold somewhere his father couldn't follow, and brought him back someone his father sometimes didn't recognize, and that this had frightened him in ways he hadn't known how to say, that he'd been proud, always completely without reservation, but that pride had sat in him like a stone sometimes, too heavy and too dense to move, and he'd said the wrong things or said nothing at all when he should have spoken. He wrote, "I want you to know that this land knows you. It's been waiting. Whatever happened out there, whatever you carry, you can bring it here. There's room." He signed it the way he'd signed Harold's birthday cards his whole life, which was simply, "Dad." Harold sat on the floor of the hallway of his grandfather's house for a long time after that. The afternoon light moved across the floor. Copper dozed against his leg. Outside, a crow called twice from somewhere near the spruce trees, and then it was quiet again. He wasn't sure how long he sat there. Long enough for the light to shift. Long enough for something he'd been carrying, something he could not have named or described or pointed to, but that had been there for a very long time, to feel fractionally lighter. He thought about Lorraine, about the house in Winnipeg and the lawyer and the savings account. He thought about how much he'd lost and how much he'd thought that loss defined what came next. He looked around at the hallway, the oak floors, the hand-turned banister, the peeling wallpaper, the wall with the secret door standing open. He looked at the letter in his hands. He thought about his father sitting at the kitchen table. That kitchen, the one 20 feet away. Writing this letter on a winter evening, putting it in the envelope, sealing it with wax, writing Harold's name. Then building the hidden space or having it built, or finding one already there, Harold didn't know. Putting the box inside and the papers and the letter and the money. All of it for whenever Harold came home, trusting that Harold would come home. He had, eventually, later than he should have, by a road longer and harder than it needed to be. But he'd come home. The following Monday, Harold drove into town and called his father's old solicitor. The same firm his father had used for 30 years, a man named Prentice, who was semi-retired now, but still came in 3 days a week, and remembered Harold's father with the warm specificity of someone who had actually known him, not just filed his paperwork. Harold spread the documents on the conference room table, and Prentice went through them slowly and carefully, asking occasional questions in the measured way of a man who has learned to take his time with things that matter. When he was finished, Prentice took off his reading glasses and held them loosely in one hand and looked at Harold. "These are good," he said. "These are very good. The original grant, both surveys, the correspondence regarding the boundary dispute. This is a complete chain of title. There's nothing here that can be challenged." Harold nodded. "Your cousin," Prentice said and hesitated. "The one who made inquiries after your father passed. He came to us as well, some months after the funeral." Harold looked at him. "He claimed there was an oral agreement," Prentice said. That your father had promised him a portion of the land in exchange for assistance during your mother's illness. He had no documentation. We told him that without documentation, the claim had no standing. But I'll be honest, I was concerned. The original grant alone might not have been sufficient if he'd pressed the matter. These surveys change that. He tapped the documents with 2 fingers. These, together, make the case airtight. Harold thought about his cousin Darwell, a man he'd seen perhaps a dozen times in his life, at family gatherings where they'd stood on opposite sides of rooms and nodded at each other with the polite wariness of people who have no particular reason for conflict but no particular reason for warmth. He hadn't known about any claim. His father hadn't mentioned it. His father, apparently, had handled it. "What do I need to do?" Harold said. "Register the original grant with the Land Titles Office. It should already be on record, but having this copy formally submitted strengthens your position. And keep these documents somewhere secure. A safety deposit box. Somewhere that isn't the wall of your house." Harold almost smiled. Right. He drove back to the farm with the documents in a file folder on the passenger seat, and Copper sitting in the back watching the road the way he always did, alert and calm and present, ears forward, eyes steady. Harold drove and didn't turn the radio on. He wanted the quiet. He was getting used to the quiet. There were things still to settle. The estate had never been fully wound up. His father had died with some debts and some complexities that Harold now had to work through properly, with Prentice's help. There would be filings and processes and waiting. He understood that. But the land was his, the letter was real, the money was real, and would go toward the renovation work his father had planned. The drawings now spread on the kitchen table where Harold looked at them every morning and tried to understand his father's vision, and then slowly, gradually, began to add his own notes in pencil alongside the old ones. He called Calvin in late May. He didn't know entirely what he intended to say. He sat on the back porch in the early evening with his coffee and dialed the number and waited. Calvin answered on the 3rd ring, surprised. "Dad, hey," Harold said. A pause. "Is everything okay?" "Yes," Harold said. "Everything's okay." He looked out across the farm. The grass had grown tall in the fields and moved in the wind in slow waves, and the light was doing the thing it did here in late spring, coming in low and gold and unhurried, catching the tops of the grass and making them shine. "I found some things that belonged to your grandfather, documents about the farm, some money he'd been saving." "What kind of money?" "Enough. I want to fix the place up properly. Your grandfather had plans." Harold paused. "I found them in the wall." There was a silence on Calvin's end that had a different quality than their usual silences. Not the field between them, but something more like attention, like someone turning toward a sound. "In the wall?" Calvin said. "Copper found it," Harold said. "The dog." Another silence. Then Calvin made a short sound that might have been a laugh. "Your dog found money in the wall, and a letter from your grandfather." "Some things," Harold stopped. He was not his father, could not write 3 pages of the true thing in careful print. But he was here, and he had learned something about what it cost to let silences stand when words were actually needed. "I thought you might want to come and see the place sometime. When you have a weekend, I've been working on it." The silence that followed was long enough that Harold thought Calvin might say no, or say he'd think about it, which was the same thing. Instead, Calvin said, "How's the end of June?" Harold looked out at the grass moving in the wind. He thought about his grandfather standing at the fence line in the evenings looking west. He thought about his father at the kitchen table, writing a letter he might never send, writing it anyway. "End of June is good," he said. He sat on the porch after he hung up, for a long time, until the light was almost gone and the first stars came out over the flat Manitoba dark. Copper lay stretched beside his chair, one paw touching Harold's foot as though he needed the contact, or perhaps knew that Harold did. The farm was quiet the way old things are quiet, full, not empty. The way a room sounds when many people have lived in it, The walls holding the accumulated weight of ordinary days, voices, seasons, the small currencies of a life lived close to the ground. Harold had not expected to end up here. He had not expected any of this. The farm, or the letter, or the dog, or the quiet, or the strange and unearned grace of sitting on his grandfather's porch, watching the dark come in and feeling, for the first time in a long time, that he was in the right place. But here he was. Copper's tail moved once against the porch boards, slow and certain, like a small answer to a question nobody had asked out loud. Here they both were,